Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Subcommittee on Economic Opportunity. Subject of today's hearing is the administration of the VA's Specially Adaptive Housing Program that provides grant funding for our severely service-connected disabled veterans to adapt their homes to make them more accessible to their needs. This small but vital program provides these true heroes with the ability to not only stay alive in their home, live independently, but live the greatest quality of life and dignity. And so I am very appreciative of the work you guys do and a strong supporter of this program, but we want the program to work most effectively. And so we'll cover a lot of ground today, but while the VA has a hand in developing the plans and policies for this program, the benefit is truly the veterans to administer, as they are responsible for choosing a contractor and supervising the construction. Some of today's witnesses have raised concerns about the amount of paperwork and processing delays associated with this benefit, and we'll dig into that some. While I understand there's a need to examine each veteran's circumstances to appropriately fund the adaptation that fits their needs, we must strive to improve the timeliness of service for all veterans. That's the goal. I also know that in some areas of the country, the amount of the SAH grant may not go as far as it does in other parts, so I am interested in hearing from our witnesses about ways to improve the timeliness of decisions and appropriately increase grant amounts as disabilities worsen. I'm also very interested, and I'm sure my colleagues are as well, to hear about the VA's effort to implement the ranking members in my bill that became Public Law 115-177, which puts SAH agents and not vocational rehab counselors in charge of adapting homes for veterans receiving independent living. Now, there's about as common sense a reform as it gets, making sure that we have SAH agents and not counselors actually working on these. We hope, and I think the goal of the legislation was to expedite these improvements and modifications, and I also was told that we might have been able to save some taxpayer dollars in the process. So a win-win, but ultimately we just want to get that service provided to those veterans in the most timely way. Finally, I'd like to commend Mr. London and his staff at the VA's Home Loan Guarantee Service for their dedication, willingness to work with the committee. With that, it's my pleasure to recognize my friend and ranking member, Mr. O'Rourke, for any opening comments he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too am looking forward to this panel's testimony and to the questions that our colleagues from both sides of the aisle ask to ensure that we are conducting the appropriate oversight of an incredibly important program, one who has a very noble mission, but one which does need to have the accountability to ensure that it's delivering the service to every eligible veteran. So looking forward to hearing what you all have to say and working with our colleagues to improve this program going forward. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. On our first and only panel, we welcome back Mr. London, Director of VA's Loan Guarantee Service, Brigadier General Tom Landwermeyer, President and CEO of Homes for Our Troops, Mr. Stephen Henry, Associate Legislative Director of Paralyzed Veterans of America, and Mr. Ryan Cools, Director of Combat Stress and Recovery of the Wounded Warrior Project. So thank you guys for all being here today, and let's get this started with Mr. London. I yield 5 minutes to you, sir.
Good afternoon, Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member O'Rourke, and other members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the Department of Veterans Affairs Specially Adapted Housing Grant Program. June of this year marked the 70th anniversary of the SAH program. Since 1948, the program has provided over 37,000 grants totaling almost $1.3 billion to veterans with severe disabilities. VA recognizes that the process of delivering SAH benefits to veterans in a timely manner requires innovation, expertise, and the ability to continuously improve. I am honored to come to work every day to advocate for and deliver services to our veterans who have earned them at great sacrifice. The original SAH program has been expanded and modified into the program we administer today, a life-changing benefit which allows veterans the freedom to select their own contractor. It can be used multiple times over a lifetime, and the grant amounts adjust annually to the cost of construction. The benefit can even be used to modify the home of a family member when veterans need family support or while they readjust after their service to the country. As I'm sure you know, the statutory requirement for determining the feasibility and suitability of the veteran's living situation is a key driver in how the program has been designed over the years. This means that VA does not just cut a check to the contractor or to the veteran and walk away. Instead, we have a duty to ensure that veterans are able to thrive in the living situation the grants help to create, and the adaptations meet each veteran's unique disability housing needs now and in the future as his or her condition changes over time. Living independently means something different for each and every veteran we serve, and each home adaptation project is uniquely different. SAH agents provide individual, in-person service to veterans in their homes, often at a time in their lives where they are vulnerable and in need of very personal assistance. SAH grants are designed to improve a veteran's quality of life and can also be life-altering for their caregivers. Take, for instance, a veteran who was confined to an upstairs bedroom in a small apartment while only being able to move every 6 months with the help of an ambulance crew who transported him for medical treatment. I take pride in knowing that because of this grant, the veteran not only has a larger bedroom, it is on the first floor with fully adaptable access to the driveway. The veteran's spouse can now stay in the same room with him and ensure that he is cared for properly. In addition to this type of scenario, many veterans residing overseas are unaware of the life-changing benefits available to them. And face-to-face engagement with these veterans allows VA to assess their living conditions and adaptation needs. We are constantly looking at ways to improve areas of the program that are directly under our control. And we have recently made several operational changes to expedite the SAH claims process, delay our grant administration, and empower our local staff to make decisions aimed at improving customer service to veterans and decreasing overall grant timeframes. We are nearing the completion of a business process reengineering study where we gathered input from veterans, private sector builders and contractors, and a variety of subject matter experts to develop a roadmap for a streamlined and technologically advanced SAH program. Additionally, we are conducting an analysis of SAH staffing and caseload distribution to determine how to best ensure that we have the right number of well-trained SAH agents in the right locations. We are also providing enhancements to the Veterans Housing Adaptation Benefits by transitioning housing modifications that are currently part of an independent living plan from the Vocational Rehabilitation and Employment Program to the SAH program. Although both programs have worked collaboratively within VA for many years, Public Law 115-177 makes it more efficient for VA to deliver housing modifications to these veterans. Starting next month, SAH staff will formally begin handling housing adaptations under an independent living plan. Finally, I would like to touch on the work we are doing to enhance our outreach to our stakeholder community and the collaborative opportunities that exist to serve severely disabled veterans. We are analyzing our existing outreach and stakeholder communication strategies to identify opportunities for additional collaboration. I know that VSOs like the ones here today, and other stakeholders seek to foster positive relationships and maintain open lines of communication so that veterans we serve can obtain the housing outcomes they deserve. We can always benefit from working with other programs and organizations to identify creative ways to enhance our program and better assist veterans. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I appreciate the opportunity you have extended to me today, and I look forward to answering any questions that you or other members of the subcommittee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. London. General Landwermeyer, now yield 5 minutes to you, sir.
Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member O'Rourke, and distinguished members of the Veterans Affairs Subcommittee on Economic Opportunity. Sincere thanks for granting Homes for Our Troops the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee to review the VA's Specially Adapted Housing Grant Program. We're familiar with the SAH grant eligibility requirements as we use the grant as a screening criterion for our program of building specially adapted custom homes for the most severely injured post-9/11 veterans. We build homes exclusively for SAH qualified veterans, with the exception of our blind veterans. Since our inception in 2004, Homes for Our Troops has worked closely with the Department of Veterans Affairs to assist our severely injured veterans, and we enjoy a close, productive working relationship. In March of this year, our staff met with the VA SAH representatives to discuss the challenges and recommendations that we highlight in our testimony. We share the concerns of our fellow VSOs and stand together before you to ensure that our nation's most severely injured veterans continue to have the opportunity to live in a barrier-free environment. We see some challenges with the SAH program as it is today. Although the grant program provides important assistance to many injured veterans, the program as it stands leaves many veterans behind, as it does not include blind veterans with no other injuries, nor veterans with the loss of both hands, as outlined in the SAH grant eligibility criteria on page 4 of our written testimony. As you can imagine, total blindness requires numerous technological and voice-activated adaptations to a home to enable the veteran to regain some of the freedom and independence that he or she has lost due to injury. Concerning the loss of both hands, whether a veteran loses his or her arms above or below the elbow, they still have lost the most important functional part, their hands. Again, this requires significant adaptations to the home. Current guidelines are confusing as to what delineates the difference between loss of arms or loss of hands. We respectfully ask your assistance in changing the SAH eligibility criteria to include non-correctable blindness in both eyes and the loss of or loss of use of both hands. Beginning 1 October 2012, 30 veterans a year who have suffered the loss of or loss of use of one lower extremity have qualified for the SAH grant under the temporary expansion of the grant, Public Law 112-154, Honor America's Veterans Act. The VA does a great job of informing eligible veterans of the SAH benefits. The area we see for improvement concerns this temporary expansion of the SAH grant criteria, which has caused some confusion in the veteran community. We see two actions that would help mitigate this confusion. One, the VA can take steps to ensure all staff are knowledgeable concerning the expansion of the grant criteria. We have encountered some situations where VA agents were unaware that a veteran should be qualified under the expansion criteria. Second, the VA could notify all veterans who were previously denied SAH eligibility prior to the expansion that took effect on 1 October 2012 that they may now meet the expanded criteria. Another area we discussed with the VA is changing how they transfer funds in conjunction with the SAH program, shifting to electronic funds transfer to both streamline the process and eliminate lost checks. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your attention, and members of the committee, appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General. We will now yield 5 minutes to you, Mr. Henry.
Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member O'Rourke, and members of the subcommittee, Paralyzed Veterans of America would like to thank you for the opportunity to offer our views on the Department of Veterans Affairs Specially Adaptive Housing Grant Programs. The Specially Adaptive Housing Grant Programs help veterans with certain service-connected disabilities to live independently in a barrier-free environment by providing critical housing adaptations. Many PVA members have benefited greatly from the Specially Adapted Housing Grant Program. The accessibility provided through this program greatly increases the quality of life for these veterans. PVA employs a highly trained force of over 70 national service officers across the nation who develop benefits claims for both member and non-member clients. After recently surveying our NSOs, we heard time and time again that SAH is a great program and the SAH agents are dedicated employees who work tirelessly in assisting veterans with completing the grant process. Even with the dedication of the SAH agents, however, veterans are still encountering difficulties. In our survey, we found 3 consistent concerns with the SAH program: finding a contractor, timeliness of the modifications, and inconsistency among the different SAH offices. PVA's first concern with the SAH program is a veteran's inability to locate a responsible and experienced contractor to complete SAH modifications. One of the complicating factors with the SAH program is that a veteran must submit 3 bids to VA as part of the process. Normally, this would not be terribly difficult for a homeowner who is completing a typical project. However, there are very few contractors who actually have experience with making home modifications for disability access. If a veteran resides in a rural area, it's even more difficult to find an appropriate contractor. With government bureaucracy comes a lot of red tape, which in the case of SAH is a lot of paperwork and procedures. VA will repeatedly ask for the same paperwork, making the process very redundant. Consequently, many contractors are not willing to work with VA. Furthermore, VA is known to take a long time to pay contractors, so they must complete the work before being compensated. This results in contractors having to carry construction costs on their own. PVA's second concern is the timeliness of modifications. After surveying our NSOs, we have found that many veterans are waiting an average of 6 to 8 months and up to 2 years to have modifications completed. The ability to safely live independently is priceless, and any processes that foster delays must be addressed. For example, the average person diagnosed with ALS lives an average of 2 to 5 years after diagnosis. Many veterans represented by PVA rarely live past 1 year after diagnosis. Therefore, timely completion of FAH modifications is imperative. There have been instances where veterans have passed away before the modifications have even been completed. Recently, PVA met with VA executive leadership to discuss the SAH program and to voice our concerns. We raised our concern with timeliness and how long veterans have to wait to receive SAH modifications. Lastly, PVA is concerned about consistency in the administration of the SAH program across the nation. PVA found a general consensus from our NSOs about concerns with the program. However, some NSOs also raised concerns about the quality and speed of the work, which seem to depend entirely on the geographic location of the veteran. Veterans should not be punished for where they choose to reside. Instead, they should be able to receive quality service regardless of the location of their residence. In some locations, SH agents are tasked with additional duties, including having to complete home appraisals for VA home loans and for veterans who are going through the process of refinance their VA mortgage. Those same agents are also required to answer phone calls from VA's general hotline number that have nothing to do with the SH program. PVA understands all positions carry the need to perform additional duties. However, to require SH agents to complete tasks unrelated to SH is unacceptable. We have also discovered that at least one office communicated to its agents that cases of terminal veterans were not to be expedited, that all veterans were to be treated the same. In light of our various concerns, we will begin meeting with the SH program leaders on a monthly basis to increase feedback on the program. We are very pleased to have this type of open communication with VA. We hope that through heightened communication with program leaders and the oversight of this subcommittee, that the program's administration will improve and result in better experience with this program for PVA members. We support Congress increasing the grant from the current amount of $81,080. In its recommendations to the 115th Congress, the co-authors of the independent budget, Disabled American Veterans, PVA, and Veterans of Foreign Wars, recommended that Congress establish a supplementary housing grant that would cover the cost of new home adaptations for eligible veterans who have already used their initial grants. Without the ability to access such a grant, veterans may be forced to choose between surrendering their independence by moving into an inaccessible home or staying in their current home simply because they are unable to afford the cost of modifying a new home. PVA would like to thank you for the opportunity to offer our views on the SH program, and we look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Henry. Mr. Cools, we yield to you 5 minutes as well.
Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member O'Rourke, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting Wounded Warrior Project the opportunity to testify on Department of Veterans Affairs Specially Adapted Housing Grant Program. My name is Ryan Cools. I serve as the Director of Wounded Warrior Project's Combat Stress Recovery Program, one of more than a dozen free programs and services our organization provides to wounded, ill, and injured service members and veterans who served on or after 9/11. Through the hard work of over 600 employees spread across the country and overseas, Wounded Warrior Project is connecting warriors and their families to their communities and each other, serving and saving lives through free, direct programs, and empowering them to succeed and live life on their own terms. Wounded Warrior Project's advocacy related to specially adapted housing is framed by two programs in particular. Our benefits service team connects warriors or assists warriors of all disability levels with their benefits claims. And our independence program is helping meet the needs of some of our most severely injured warriors by ensuring they receive the care, services, and resources they need to thrive in the most independent and meaningful way possible. Today, I also speak to you as someone who has utilized the SHA grant, and I hope my story can help frame the issues before the subcommittee. So I was injured in 2005 in combat in Iraq. I lost my right arm and left leg, and at the time was 24 years old, newly married, didn't have any children. I was very fortunate to make it back to Walter Reed and spent about 18 months there recovering. I medically retired from the Army in May of 2007. And in 2009, my wife and I decided that we wanted to stay in the area and found a house that we felt comfortable in staying in the long term and decided to use our SAH grant to modify that home. In 2009, the grant cap was about $64,000, but unfortunately it didn't cover the over $100,000 that it cost to modify our home to meet my individual needs and make sure that I was successful and independent in the house. Fortunately, we have three beautiful little kids, and over time, our family grew, and we realized that we needed to change homes in order to better meet our growing family's needs. And in 2015, we sold the home that we had purchased in 2009. Fortunately, we didn't take a loss with the sale of the home, but we weren't fully able to recoup the amount of the SHA grant. In our current home that we had purchased in 2015, we've modified that home to, again, meet my individual and personal needs. I'm free to move about the home and shower and do all the things I need to do in activities of daily living. Those modifications cost over $90,000 to complete to date. So in this whole process, one of the things that I've learned is my needs are going to increase. As I age, I'll need additional adaptations, and the way the program sits right now, those changes are going to be my responsibility. So with that, I'd like to share with you two of the most significant areas that we have identified to help improve the SHA grant program for both myself and for other veterans and service members with catastrophic injuries. First, we urge the subcommittee to eliminate the 3-time use cap that restricts the full and intent benefit of this program. Under current rules, veterans and service members may only draw from their $81,080 SHA grant total three times. As disabilities worsen and families move, it is possible, and even likely, that a veteran will need to utilize portions of their $81,000 grant on more than 3 occasions. As a point of reference, according to a 2016 census study, homeowners will move on average 5 times in their life, and renters will move even more frequently. In order to make the Specially Adapted Housing Grant Program more closely aligned with the way veterans and service members can reasonably be expected to live their lives, we recommend removing the condition that a grant may only be drawn from 3 times. Grants would continue to have the monetary limits, but there is no compelling reason to restrict this benefit with an arbitrary and unnecessary use cap. Our second recommendation is to allow previous beneficiaries the opportunity to refresh their Specially Adaptive Housing Grant history once every 10 years. We understand Congress needs to cap benefit amounts for budgetary reasons. However, it is not uncommon for veterans, such as myself, to utilize a full SAHA grant and years later find themselves spending their own funds for modifications. In order to help VA meet these veterans' needs, we suggest the full benefit be reinstated for those in the program every 10 years to accommodate for moving and the progression of disability needs, which in many cases can and should be expected. This benefit is reserved for the most catastrophically injured, and the specially adapted housing grants should be a lifelong program to support lifelong injuries. I, on the behalf of Wounded Warrior Project, thank the subcommittee and its distinguished members, the invitation to testify, and stand ready to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Cools. I think I can confidently speak for the committee. We appreciate your tremendous sacrifice. And we want this program to work for guys like you. You just make me so proud. And all of you, thank you for your service. And let's have a good discussion and see if we can't find ways to make improvements to this much needed and important program. Let me start with you, Mr. London, on the bill that we passed, the one I passed with my colleague, Mr. O'Rourke. What's the timeline again for, as you said, next month? What are the logistics in that? Is it pretty simple to transition to the SAH agents from the VOC rehab counselors? Do you think it's going to have the positive impact that we all intended when we passed that law?
Your colleagues for passing that legislation. I do believe that it will help us to be more efficient to serve veterans who need housing modifications. And to specifically answer your question, I am extremely confident that starting on October 1st, we'll administer the housing modifications under the Specially Adapted Housing Program processes. The reason why I'm very confident of that is, as I mentioned in my oral statement, that for over a decade, we've been working very closely with VR&E on these cases, and our agents have familiarity with them. And a lot of the times, the cases are much simpler than the normal SAH cases that we administer. So I'm extremely confident that we'll be ready October 1st. We will make some additional enhancements to make things run smoothly and to have documented policies and procedures for staff by January, but staffs are already aware of the transition on both sides of the house, and I'm extremely confident.
Mr. London, thank you. Describe the organization for me, because I'm often perplexed by how things are actually run and operated and who's on the ground making these things happen. Sometimes you got policy over here and the operations over there, and maybe they don't even talk. Break this down for me. Who the SAH agents work for whom? For you?
No, they do not.
Okay. Who do they report to?
They report to the regional office director in their location.
So in their respective regions. So
That's correct.
is there a standard practices and procedures for the SAH, or is this another one of those we decentralize it so everybody does it a little differently?
No, sir, that's where I come in. I do own the standardization. I own the policies and procedures that the regional offices across the country administer to my standard.
If I asked you who the best region was right now, could you tell me?
I would argue that they are all serving our veterans.
Now, come on now. No, I love all my children too, but one's faster than the other, and one's better at writing. And so I'm just saying, I'm not going to ask you to call them out. I'm just saying, do you know who the best region is in terms of implementation of your policies in this program?
Just like any program or even any business concern, you always have entities out there who are leaders and who have best practices. And yes, I can identify those places that have best practices, and I leverage those best practices when I learn of them.
Mr. London, I want to remind you, this is not a Supreme Court justice hearing. We're just trying to get to the... No, listen, the one thing I think, because I think there's a lot to discuss here, and I think some reasonable consideration to what if someone loses a hand, but they don't lose their arm, or they lose the functionality of their arm, have they effectively lost? I mean, I'm curious to know how we set the standard, why we set the standard. I mean, there's obviously cost involved. Also on the 3-time use of the cap that you mentioned, Mr. Cools, I mean, it seems to me there's a reasonable argument of being able to draw that down again. There's a money issue and there's offsets, but just on, I think one thing we could all agree on that doesn't cost us anything, probably would save money, is finding operational efficiencies. And Mr. Henry brought up quality contractors, the difficulty of that, the paperwork involved, he used the word duplicative, 6 to 8 months to get these projects completed, and at maybe in the worst case scenario, 2 years. So how are we going to streamline? You said you have a process redesign. Break that down. I've got 30 seconds, but if you'll just answer that. And and then answer why in the world wouldn't we prioritize terminally ill veterans if we're going to expedite anybody's project so they have the best quality of life in their last days of their life. Why in the world wouldn't we do that? Maybe you are, but I heard that wasn't the case. So try to answer as much of that as you can, and after that, I'm going to delegate or defer to my ranking member for his 5 minutes.
If you don't mind, I'm going to start with the last point first. I want to be very clear that the statement about prioritization has some truth to it. We do not prioritize one veteran over another. However, with a veteran with a terminal disease in this program, we have communicated to our specially adapted housing agents they are to expedite that case. And let me explain what that means. By expediting the case, if you know you have a terminally ill veteran and there are specific modifications that they need right now, instead of looking at the full assessment of what they would need over a long-term period, streamline the process and give those immediate modifications like modifying the bathroom, giving access ramps, things like that. So we do expedite the adaptations that veterans need. So I think there's a distinction between prioritization and expediting, so I want to make that clear. As far as operational efficiencies, I agree with you wholeheartedly. That's why we're doing the study that we're doing, and we've already realized some efficiencies from things that we've learned. One thing that we've done just last year with the authority that I have, I made the decision that even though there were some potential legal impediments in VA providing a list of contractors, I leaned forward because it was the best thing to do for veterans, and I now make a list of contractors who have done previous projects available to veterans with all the necessary disclaimers so that all parties know that the government is not endorsing or recommending contractors, but we've already seen that having a lift, and as we get that more streamlined and across the regions, we're going to see that have a big lift. So there are things like that we're doing, common sense things when we're working with contractors, making sure that they understand the process up front, because as Mr. Henry said, there is sometimes back and forth, and what the back and forth is that if we say that a ramp has to be in a home, it has to meet certain specifications for that veteran. And sometimes what we see in the plans is it's not documented. And as you know, what's written is what gets done, and that's what we hold people accountable for. So if the plans and specifications don't meet the veteran's needs, that's setting up the veteran for failure. So what can we do to streamline the process? Make the process better known up front. So those are some of the things that we're doing.
And I'm going to yield for 5 minutes to the ranking member, but if I might just indulge for just a minute. At some point, I want to know what the timeframes are today on average to put in a ramp, apples to apples, and what we're trying to reduce the timeframe, for example. So some hard targets, some
Sure.
real sort of empirical movement. You don't have to talk about that now unless they want to dig into it, but I'd like to know what those goals are, because what gets measured gets done, and it'd be nice to have some measurable goals in reducing timeframes and other sort of burdens. Mr. O'Rourke, thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask a few questions that were just generated by comment from the panelists. But first, Mr. Cools, I want to make sure I understand the anecdotes that you shared. You said that the total cost to rehabilitate the first home that you and your wife moved into was $100,000. If you don't mind telling me how much of that was covered by the SAH program.
Yes, sir. That is correct. The total cost was $100,000, and the grant cap at that time was just over $64,000.
So you received $64,000 to that 100.
Yes, sir.
And the second home was $90,000 cost, and how much did you receive towards that?
Zero, sir, because I had
exhausted
my grant. Yes, sir.
And so as Mr. Lund, as that cap, as the aggregate cap moves up and it's now at $81,000, would someone in Mr. Cool's position be able to reapply for the additional difference, the $20,000 between the 60 and the 80 that is the current cap?
So as long as the veteran has remaining grant funds available, as the grant increases each year, those funds are made available up to the statutory limit.
How about just using his anecdote? He used 60 so many years ago, and now that it is up to 80, does he have a $20,000 balance for the next modification?
No, sir, we don't have the statutory authority to do that.
Okay, so that's something you need from us if we were to make that change. That's helpful. Let me ask a couple of questions that General Landwermeyer posed. On the issue of total blindness and the loss of both hands, do you need statutory clarification, or is that something you can administratively correct and provide clarification for the contractors?
My understanding is we do not have statutory authority for those circumstances.
Okay, so that one's on us as well.
The statute is very specific in the
Okay.
criteria.
Because you mentioned, General, that the guidelines are confusing. And so my question is just, how do we clarify? And it sounds like, according to Mr. London, that's going to be through law. How about educating VA staff? The comment was made that some staff are unaware of guidelines or aren't, perhaps educated enough to be able to provide clear guidance to contractors or veterans. Any comment on that, Mr. London?
So because the statute is clear on what the criteria are, even for the temporary expansion, the staff in the Veteran Service Center on the disability compensation side of the house, they rate cases to that criteria. So as soon as a veteran meets that criteria, we get the rating decision that veteran is eligible. So my staff in Loan Guarantee understand and are aware of the requirements because it's in the Veterans Award letter.
No room for improvement there.
No, sir.
Okay.
I think, but just if I can just clarify, I think going back to what the Brigadier General was saying is that if the law was clear to include those criteria, then we would be able to administer the grant.
How about, this seemed like a great suggestion to me, notify all veterans who've been previously denied that they may now be eligible. Is that something, once you get the clarification from Congress that you need by statute, that you can administratively pursue? Or do you need authorization and appropriation specific to that from Congress?
We can administratively pursue that. I don't need any assistance on that, but there's a point I want to bring up. Not only is the criteria very specific, but there's a cap in statute to 30 veterans per year. So even if I were to reach out to those specific veterans, we may have already exceeded our statutory cap for that year.
What's the logic behind that cap?
That was specifically, I think, to be quite candid, a costing issue from your side of the house, sir.
Okay. The point raised about electronic funds transfer.
I'm glad that was brought up today because I'm happy to report that we have a pilot program that we're working on in our St. Paul regional office that we believe we'll be able to streamline the transfer of monies, and we will be able to do things via electronic file transfer. So I'm extremely excited about that in the future.
Do you think that meets the spirit of Mr. Henry's concern about the paperwork is asked for repeatedly and it's a disincentive for contractors to work with the VA on this? When you're doing electronic funds transfer, are you also digitizing other aspects of this? So it's you file the information once, it's within the VA, and it gets processed and you're paid in a timely fashion. Is that essentially the idea here in terms of what you're trying to achieve?
The electronic funds transfer is a separate issue. I think the other piece is more of a communication issue and this improvement on VA's part to ensure that the contractor understands up front what the requirements are to avoid the back and forth.
And just last point, my time's about up, but I also noticed that Mr. Henry mentioned inconsistency by different SAH offices. The General mentioned the need to perhaps educate VA staff who may be unaware of qualifications. I'd just take that as constructive criticism and see if there isn't a way to better educate all VA staff on these issues. And maybe this is a perfect opportunity for an offline conversation with the General and Mr. Henry to find out what the specific concerns are and to bring that back to your team just to make sure that everyone's on the same page on these issues. So.
Yes,
thanks.
sir.
Appreciate it, Mr. London.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. Mr. Bilirakis, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it very much, and I thank all of you for your service. I have a couple questions. To follow up with the Chairman's question, your testimony, Mr. Henry, actually, your testimony mentions concerns about those with terminal illnesses like ALS not being prioritized for SAH benefits at the VA. Could you share more about these concerns and the steps needed to fix this problem?
Is that question?
Mr. Henry, yes.
Okay. Thank you for that question. We're concerned that the men and women that are diagnosed with this disease just aren't being placed in the front of the line. And just to give you an example, so I've assisted 5 veterans personally with their claims for ALS and service-connected disability compensation. Out of those 5, none of them made it to a year. They all died probably less than 9 months after a diagnosis. The most recent one was diagnosed in November, and he passed away in March. The spouse of that veteran refused to use the VA program because when she spoke to, the person or the agent, they said it was going to be about 9 months to a year before they actually received the modifications to the home. Now that veteran, the first time I met him in October, he could walk, he could talk, he's kind of mumbled a little bit, but he was still coherent. He was drinking a cup of coffee. I saw him in December. He was in a wheelchair. He no longer feed himself. He could no longer talk. He had to be on a respirator. So the disease manifests to such a rapid degree that within 5 to 6 months, their condition is just so negatively impacted that it's so important that these modifications are done as soon as possible. 6 to 8 months go by, these men and women are completely different, and their needs are completely different. And so we just feel that these men and women need to be placed ahead of the line. I actually had a conversation with Mr. Cools about this, and I said, look, I'm going to bring up my testimony that I feel that men and women with terminal illness should be placed in line. I'm not trying to say anything about your condition or your personal experience, but PVA membership really believes that our members who have a terminal illness should be placed ahead in line. And Mr. Cools even said, I agree with you. If someone does have a terminal illness, they should be placed in front of the line.
Mr. London, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, Mr. Henry, I agree with your sentiment about the expedition that these veterans need. And you have my commitment, and I want to give the commitment to the committee that we will focus on this issue. In just 2 weeks, I'm going to be meeting with all of the management staffs from around the country. Every region will be with me face to face, and this will be a topic that I will spend considerable time with to make sure that it's crystal clear how we are to expedite these cases so that we can serve those men and women with terminal illnesses who are eligible for this program. But I want to be very clear that I'm not going to give instruction to put one veteran in front of another. I have an ethical duty to make sure that we're serving every veteran, but I think we can lean forward and get these veterans what they need faster than we're doing today. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. For Mr. London, in your experience, how often do veterans have to pay out of pocket to have home adaptations completed?
It's hard to put a hard number to that. I certainly can give you anecdotal experience, not only from my leadership experience, but I spent over a year on the SAH policy staff, so I have an intimate knowledge of the process. And in a significant number of cases, like Mr. Cools, veterans do have to put some monies into the project because the grant does not cover all of their needs. So that certainly doesn't happen in every case, but I would certainly quantify it as a significant number.
Okay, let me ask you, and I also want to ask the general if he's in agreement with that, the assessment, but also some of the nonprofits that actually build homes for veterans who are disabled. Do they have access, or does the veteran have access to those grants? How does that work? Does anybody want to respond to that?
Sir, I'd be glad to. We build our specially adapted custom homes across the country, and then we donate them to the veterans. So if they have already used part of their SAH grant, wherever they may be living before they go into our home, they still have the rest of it left over if they want to do something additional in the home. Our homes have more than 40 special adaptations inside them to let them regain that freedom and independence that they lost from their injuries.
So, Mr. Cools, if you had a home that was, obviously you earned it, but let's say a nonprofit actually built a home for you and your family, which I commend them so very much for doing, Would these 40 adaptations, is that suitable to you, or would you have to go out of pocket or spend the rest of your grant to make it suitable for you, to adaptable or convenient for you to live? If you could answer that, I'd appreciate it.
Of course, thank you. I think with having a nonprofit step in and be able to do that, we're very fortunate to have the support of other nonprofits that are able to raise the support of communities in order to pay for these modifications. But with this age program, the intent of it is to be a lifelong benefit for injuries that are going to extend for a lifetime. So knowing that as folks do move 5 times over the course of a lifetime, being able to have a home that they're able to move from one place to another, if they want to retire and be closer to their children, being able to continue that support over the course of a lifetime, I think is vitally key.
Very good. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, my concern is, I've got a few concerns, but the out-of-pocket. I mean, how many veterans can afford? How can anyone afford these out-of-pocket necessary adaptations? But thank you so very much for your service. Looking forward to working on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Takano, you have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to remember that little trick you used with I don't have any children, that's the problem. I can't say that, I love all my children, but one of them runs faster than the other. But that's the advantage of being a father. All right. Mr. London, can you tell me how much of your caseload or how much of the entire SAH caseload has terminal patients, like those with ALS, for example?
Yeah, to kind of put it into perspective, we have about 4,000 active cases around the nation for specially adapted housing right now, and approximately 300 of those are veterans with terminally ill conditions, including ALS. So the workload is relatively small comparative to the overall workload.
So it's less than 10% of the total, about
Yes.
Slightly less than 10%
That's
of the
correct.
total number. So 4,000 would be served by this program. Well, we might. I see you having to parse your words very carefully, not put in one that the use of the word priority versus expedite. But I used to be an English teacher. I think it's very important to be very clear. I think the practical outcome is that we want people who have ALS or who have a terminal illness, and we know with people with ALS they're going to have changing needs. That we need to be practical, and we need to have a government program that responds to them. And it makes no sense that the spouse has to turn down turn down this program because they can't practically use it, and that's not really serving the veterans. So, what do we need to do to change to have the ability to be able to be more plain speaking, to be able to more forthright? I'm not calling you not forthright, but there's something in the regulations that doesn't allow you to be forthright.
Here's my commitment to you, because I agree with your sentiments about using common sense approaches, and that's exactly what I'm saying about expediting the processes. I believe there are things that we can do in my program without a statutory or regulatory change to get these services to those men and women faster than we are today. So I would like the opportunity to do that first without any other statutory, because I think I can get there.
Fair enough. So my friends at the PVA are going to be able to tell me in a short period of time, that this is no longer a problem for their terminally ill patients or terminally ill veterans that need this service.
I think over a short period of time, they will be able to report to you improvements, for sure.
Okay. Well, I'll be interested to know, but I'll be in touch. How do you see the SAH working with the VA home loan program? Are there improvements we can make so that the two programs can support each other to make home purchases easier for disabled veterans who require home modifications?
I would argue that the two programs work really well together today, because the staff who do SAH also work with the other folks in our regional loan centers who do the home loan programs. They have a good working knowledge of how that process works. I would say that the SAH job is one of the most rewarding and challenging jobs in VA, because not only are they talking to the veterans about our program, they're educating the veteran about other programs, including the home loan program. So I would argue that we already have the expertise and knowledge where it needs to be.
Thank you. Mr. Kuehls or anybody else, would you have a different point of view? Would there be, I mean, it's a chance for you to maybe reiterate some of the things you said at the end of your testimony.
As far as my particular situation, I actually utilized the home loan program to purchase the house that we did in 2015, and that process was very much seamless. So, I have no concerns about that process, but
so you very much think the two programs work well together. You would echo the comments of Mr. London.
Sir, the program, home loan program, worked independently because at that time I didn't have any SH grant funds remaining. So
I see.
I was out on my own to be able to secure that mortgage and be able to purchase that home, and then have the capital to make the modifications myself.
In the time remaining, I just want you to reiterate the ask that you made. You summarized at the end how you would change the program for someone like you who, what kind of struck me is you said that you started off as a younger man, you gain children, you want to move into a bigger house, that the program needs to account for individuals. And with only 4,000 currently in the program, and I don't know what the numbers would do if we started to make changes, when that would add people like you to the program, because we were going to change it. But kind of reiterate those changes, because I want to hear those.
Yes, sir. So if you took the example of someone purchasing and modifying a home at the age of 30, and an average person moves 5 times in their lifetime, if you were able to authorize folks to be able to utilize their grant in its totality once every 10 years, that would carry a veteran that qualifies for this grant from age 30 to age 80 in an adaptive house that is able to meet their needs and allow them to live independently.
So you'd be asking for a resetting of be able to use the grant?
Yes, sir.
Anticipating that every 10 years. I mean, that's a sensible ask, and I think a reasonable one. Anything else?
Sir, I think the cap on drawing from the grant 3 times needs to be done away with folks moving, as I said, every 5 times over the course of a lifetime. That is an opportunity to be able to do away with that and allow folks to utilize their $81,080 grant cap and whatever modifications they need, and not have to worry about it over the course of their time.
All right, thank you. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ticano. Mr. Correo, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, veterans. Thank you very much for your service to our great country. You are appreciated. You are our heroes. Mr. Kuehls, thank you very much for some of those comments and recommendations just made to Mr. Ticano. Mr. London, I wanted to follow up. You said something that touched me, which is you don't want to choose one vet over another. So my question would be, why have a waiting time at all? Why do you have to wait? Are we short on personnel to process these applications? Are we going through a process to try to minimize fraud, waste, and abuse? Are we trying to figure out whether some of these veterans actually should be qualified to get these grants? We know what their needs are. And so why is it that we have to wait so long? Lack of personnel, lack of folks to actually go through and process the applications, or is it lack of qualified contractors in our communities that are needed to move ahead with these construction projects? Why is it that we have a waiting line at all?
I would argue that we do have the right staff. Let me point out some parts of the process to you. First, as soon as we get a rating decision from the disability compensation staff, within 1 or 2 days, we're in contact with that veteran and his or her family. And within 30 days, over 98% of the time, we are in that veteran's home talking to him or her and their family members. So from a timeliness standpoint, our staff are on top of things right away. Where the timeline comes in is once we, and let me point out another piece. While we're there during the initial interview, in most cases, the veteran wants to modify that existing home. So while the SAH agent is there, They are actually looking at that home, assessing the veteran's needs, and taking documented notes on what's needed for that veteran. So within 30 days, to your point, we have a really good idea of what the needs are. The next part of the process, we now empower the veteran to choose the contractor. And that's where I mentioned that one of the administrative decisions that I made was to provide a list of contractors in that veteran's area who have done previous projects.
So essentially, a list of qualified contractors. Here you
Contractors who
are,
have
pick
some-
one and
Yes.
go.
Now, in some locales, there is a need to identify more contractors, and that's something that my staff is taking on, is how can we work with the private sector to make sure that people understand this benefit so that they can sign up and be a part of the roster, if you will, for veterans to make that decision. So there are some things that we can do from an administrative perspective, but we empower the veteran and we assist the veteran in making a decision, but it's his or her decision on who they contract with. And I do want to clarify one point. I believe in Mr. Henry's testimony, he mentioned that there's a requirement for 3 bids. That is a standard, but obviously we work with the veteran, and the veteran can waive that requirement so that we can move things faster. So there are things that we're doing from a common.
You know, in my area, excuse me for interrupting
Yes.
you, in my area in Southern California, we have a lot of veteran-owned construction companies. They're always fighting for business. Is there any way we can make it a win-win to get those veteran-owned construction companies to actually service some of these veterans?
I would love if you and your staff can give me a list of those, and anyone else who has stakeholders like that. I would love to talk and meet with them.
I'd like to work with you on that because, again, you have a shortage, and yet over there we have excess capacity.
I would
Please
love to do
continue.
that. Thank you.
Are you done, or do you have any other additional comments?
No, sir.
Again, my thought is, how do we streamline this process? Everybody's on the same page. Let's get it done in a timely manner, and it's not pointing fingers, but rather let's figure out how to do this correctly.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time.
Mr. Correa, I'm just going to ask the ranking member if he has any follow-up questions or comments. I do not. I just have a couple, and I understand if you guys have to leave. I hope you don't, but if you have to, I understand. But I just have a couple. Again, back to the organization and how we make the organization work to perform for the desired outcomes that we all have, seems to, that component seems to trip up a lot of good programs and ideas. Mr. London, what would you do to change the overall operation to make it work more effectively and efficiently to serve the veteran customer? I mean, if you could just have total control, and then is that something we could do to help you, or is that an internal sort of organizational decision?
I believe it's an internal organizational decision first and foremost, but I will tell you that within my span of control, I believe I do have the authority to make the decisions that I need to make sure that each and every regional loan center where these specially adapted housing agents are located to work with the veterans consistently. I believe that I do have that span of control today through policies and procedures and the oversight that I conduct.
Can you fire an SAH agent?
I cannot, no,
Can you
sir.
fire a regional director?
No, sir.
I don't think you have enough control. And I'm not saying I know how to wire it so that you do, but you set the policy and you set the guidelines and you set maybe even the benchmarks for how long it should take to put a ramp in or a grab bar. But who's going to enforce that so that there's a sense of urgency and commitment to meeting those standards? I don't think it's you, and not trying to be disrespectful. I wish it were, because I have a lot of confidence in you, quite frankly. But who is going to ensure that your policies, assuming that the benchmarks and policies that you've laid out are best practices for these sorts of things, who will ensure that that happens? Who has the power to fire folks? And I'm not suggesting we fire folks, but we try to get them to the point where they can do their job optimally. But if they can't, who are they accountable to? The regional director, I assume.
That's correct. And then the way it works today is if I see someone who is not upholding the standards that I set, I can work with my peers who has that particular authority.
Okay. The authority to hold the regional
Hold people
director
accountable. That's correct. That's correct.
When's the last time a region was taken to task because they were not hitting the benchmarks for these things to serve these heroes of ours? When's the last time that you were upset with the way they were performing, the region, and that they were taken to task for that?
I will be very candid with you. I had a critical conversation with a frontline supervisor just several weeks ago where I was unhappy. So I spoke to that accountable manager who reports to the regional office director. I went directly to that individual and explained my discomfort and what they needed to do, in my view, to get back on track.
The next time we have someone in the chain of command for those regional directors, you need to let them know that I'm going to ask about how they manage and how they hold their regional directors accountable for these particular performance goals, because they're just, everything's important, but those who've borne the battle the most, I mean, there are a lot of great programs and for our veterans, and we love and respect them all, and we want to serve them, but I just can't imagine a service that we provide that's just more important that we deliver on than what you're working on this program we're talking about. Do we need to pass a law to allow you to say you'll make the terminally ill veteran a priority and not just expedited?
In order for me to put one veteran ahead of another, I believe I do not have that statutory authority. That's my understanding.
Okay. Well, we're going to give that to you. I can't imagine anybody on this committee that would disagree that 300 out of 4,000 cases shouldn't be prioritized because of what Mr. Henry articulated earlier. And I bet you there's no, is there anybody on the panel that disagrees with that? Would y'all be in full agreement for us to pass a law so that he can prioritize those who are terminally ill?
And Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, what I would like to do is to go back and confirm and report back to you whether or not we have the statutory authority or not.
Okay, please do. Last question, just on numbers. Did you say you do have or don't have the average payout or drawdown per veteran for these modifications? So with exhausting all three, if they did exhaust all three, or if they just chose to draw down one time, what's the average?
Well, I can give you that number. I just don't have that number off the top of my head, but we do have the capability to get that number.
You know approximately, is it 60, 70, 75? Is it lower? Can you give me a ballpark?
I would say is north of 50%.
Okay.
That's my
North of
guesstimate.
50% of the total.
Of the total, that's correct.
Okay. But it's not 79, 99, 99.
I would have to look at the numbers, but I can't make a commitment to you, but I would say it's definitely north of 50%.
And what ballpark range, what percentage of veterans like Ryan over there drew down 100% and had a net amount left over because it just cost him $90,000, whatever the cost was greater than the benefit? Do you know the percentage of veteran that is in a situation like that of all your customers?
I want to make sure I understand your question, because Mr. Kuhl's situation was a little bit different. If I understand correctly, at the time that he went through the SAH process, the grant amount was around $64,000, and he exhausted that grant amount, but he needed more at that time.
In that case, what percentage of veterans don't have enough to draw down to meet their need?
Oh, I'll answer the question this way, sir. I believe in each and every case that we have, if we had more dollars available, we would be able to provide more adaptive features.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. Ranking member, yield time to you.
Sorry, and sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Chairman. I just one quick thought,
Yes.
and hopefully you agree, just given that we've got Mr. London here, we have someone who helps to do the contracting and construction and is very familiar with the process, someone who advocates for veterans and helps shepherd them through the process, and somebody who's been through the process. I wonder, given all the great suggestions that we got from Mr. Kuhl's talking about 3-time eligibility, and the general's suggestion on clarifying the limitations on blindness and dual amputation. Some of the other suggestions and questions that came up: would it be possible for our two staffs and Mr. London to work together on cost estimates for Mr. Kuhl's suggestion, understanding what that would be, whatever statutory changes we need to make per Mr. London's advice, and then share that with the committee. And if there's common ground on some of these issues, and I think there's going to be, and it requires an act of Congress, we can begin that from this committee. Because I think we've got all the necessary stakeholders here to make that progress. And whatever you can do administratively, Mr. London, and you can report back to us and say, hey, I've been able to take care of this issue, all the better. And then we can go back to our constituents and share that as well. So that'd just be the suggestion for
Not only
all
is
parties
that
here.
a reasonable consideration, that to me is the essence of our job, and I'm glad you mentioned that, and let's make that happen. Mr. London will execute on that after we close out today, and then we'll have that additional discussion with the members of the committee. So great suggestion. Again, really appreciate you guys. Very informative and productive. I'm going to say it again, Mr. London. I'm always impressed with you and your professionalism. That's not easy, because I get very frustrated with these hearings and what's not happening that I think should happen. But you conduct yourself well, and you represent, I think, the very best of the VA. I really believe that. So thank you for your professionalism and your forthrightness. Let's keep working together. It will only work when you identify things that, as my colleague suggested, where we can help, because you can't and your organization can't. It's a matter of law and policy that Congress must take up. So keep the lines of communication open. God bless, and
Thank you.
And we'll close out with these formal remarks. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material in today's hearing. Hearing no objection, so ordered. This hearing is adjourned.